This is the One Thing Podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Adam Rindy. The One Thing Podcast brings together leaders in functional and naturopathic medicine to discuss actionable information that may unlock puzzles in the areas of gut health, brain health, metabolism, and longevity. Please note, these episodes do not replace the opinion of your doctor. They are not intended to diagnose or treat any condition. Please discuss this information with your provider and discuss your own unique personal health history before adapting this information. Please subscribe to our episodes so that you can stay on top of the most current information in these areas of medicine. Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Adam Rindy, and welcome to the next episode of the One Thing Podcast. In this episode, I welcome on Dr. Orli Petter, who is a trauma psychologist and neuropsychologist out of the Los Angeles area, and is heading up an organization called the Israeli Healing Initiative. In this episode, the conversation delves into her experience working as a trauma psychologist, her father's profound impact on her career choice as he is a Holocaust survivor. The conversation goes into the effects of generational trauma, the physiologic and psychological responses to significant trauma events, and her steps taken to aid the survivors of the Nova Festival and the attacks on the kibbutzim in the Negev desert during the recent October 7th, 2013 attacks. Dr. Petter highlights her work with the Israeli Healing Initiative, emphasizing the importance of neurostimulation in trauma treatment, and her ongoing efforts to provide support across affected communities, including Jewish, Palestinian, Bedouin, and Druze populations. The discussion includes poignant survivor stories and touches upon the broader implications of trauma within a global context. In our conversation, we hear stories of heroism during October 7th, the importance of social support, the difference between real trauma and perceived trauma, and the need for practical solutions to promote post-traumatic growth. By listening to this, you'll gain some valuable knowledge on the trauma response, including the application of vagal stimulation, neurostimulation, and also understand ways to support continued efforts in mitigating trauma's impact on the Middle East population that's going through this horrific time. Dr. Petter's biography is quite extensive, and I've listed all of her accolades in the show notes. I wanted to say one comment is she has such a deep training in trauma, and out of her desire to help what's going on in the Middle East, she has head up this organization called the Israeli Healing Initiative. And you should know that they've been able to fly trauma victims back to Los Angeles for treatment and continued care on the ground in Israel for people with acute trauma. Really encourage all listeners to support their organization by going to israelhealinginitiative.org. That's by going to israelhealinginitiative.org, the website where you can support their work. You can also find them on Instagram and on Facebook. Dr. Petter's biography is quite extensive, and you can see that in the show notes. Not only is she an astute clinician, she has been in teaching. She's received many degrees, including a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, in psychology, and she is someone who has just an extreme depth of knowledge in this area. So we're very fortunate to be able to hear her speak and share her insights with us. So without further ado, welcome to the next episode of the One Thing Podcast. Dr. Petter, welcome to the One Thing Podcast. It's so great to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, it's been great getting to know you a little bit before getting online here.
And you only know me a little bit so far.
Yeah, it's been great so far. So yeah, I love to kind of talk about a few things that we connected to before we got online. One of them is just a shared background of your being related to Holocaust survivors, and your father is a Holocaust survivor. And I just would love to hear a little bit about how that shaped you and your, kind of your path in life, and some of the ways that his journey in life has influenced you.
Well, of course, it had a major impact. My father and my uncle were Holocaust survivors, and they were both heroes. I looked up to both of them, and they didn't see themselves in the same way, which I find repeated with the Nova survivors that I'm treating now. So we lost about 30 members of our family in the Holocaust.
Mm.
And so all celebrations were always empty, not just
Mm.
empty physically, but empty a hole in my heart, even
Hmm.
because there's very little family.
Right.
And, when you go to the doctor, to this day, when I go to the doctor, I don't know, I can't fill out the forms, the intake forms in terms of, illnesses, in my family, in half of my family, because who knows, they were all murdered by the Nazis. So it has that ongoing effect. But my father is, because he's still alive, one of the most empathic men. He's also a very strong, macho man, but his heart is like butter. And I could feel it all the time growing up. He had a vow of silence. He would not talk about the Holocaust, but you could feel it. And I could feel it in my gut. I could feel it. I could feel
Mm.
like heart wrenching pain when he was around. And so I always tried to soothe him. It's probably one of the reasons why I became a trauma psychologist. And when he was 70 years old, I took him to Poland. It was the year
Mm.
2000. So Poland was fresh from being a communist country. And, I did a lot of prep work with him. And he said it was the most life changing experience for him to go back once he was prepped.
Hmm.
Um, and nothing could make me happier than that.
Hmm.
Um, so he always had, because of his experiences, even though he didn't speak about it, my mother would whisper to us about what happened to him so that we would understand why he
Mm.
was the way he was. And he was
Mm.
a driven man. I shouldn't say was, he is still alive.
Yeah.
Um, and, after going through what he went through, he was in the Lodz ghetto. And at the beginning of the war, there were 250,000 Jews living in Lodz. And by the end of the war, there were only 700 left in the Lodz ghetto, and my father was one of them.
Hmm.
And it was due to his, I call it intuition, but he calls it an angel. Whatever it is, we don't know. We're too ignorant to know these things. It was through that he was able to save his mother and his brother,
Hmm.
and everybody else perished.
Hmm.
Um, and so he always had a very deep view of the world, and that always inspired me. Like he was never, um, highly reactive to things, to most things, I should say, that would happen in the world. Like when 9/11 happened, and my friends and I were like, oh no, what's going to happen? Because in the beginning, I don't know what it was like for you, but here in LA, we all had sisters or family or colleagues that were in New
Hmm.
York. And so we
Right.
were directly impacted. And we didn't know in the beginning how long or what else would happen, because, the worldview we had was shattered, and we didn't know, we didn't have enough data yet how to reconstruct the world. So,
Right.
so there was a lot of anxiety. And I remember my friends were telling me ask your father to get us some gas masks, because he's living in Israel then, and they were giving
Okay.
gas masks because Saddam at that time had was already, previous to that was already sending missiles and things like that, and so I'll never forget his reaction when I asked him. Um, it was like he was patronizing me in a sense, like, okay, Orly, sure. If that'll make you happy,
Right.
we'll get you the gas masks.
Right.
It's like he had seen everything and nothing
Yeah.
could really move him that much.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of um, talk about, you know, children of Holocaust survivors and just how, there's like a whole generation that went through their own uh, the own fallout of being a child of a Holocaust survivor. It sounds like you had at least the benefit of someone sharing a little bit about what he might be going through and what he experienced, like sharing some insight as to what your dad went through. You weren't completely in the dark.
Yeah, yeah. I have to thank my mother for that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's interesting, and you think about how the environment and the support you know has such an impact on our world experience.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It's major. It's major in terms of the intensity of PTSD that you get. It's a factor. It's major in terms of, because trauma bifurcates, it transforms people. So you either get worse or you get better afterwards. Like you're
Right.
never going to be the same.
Yeah.
And I mean, I just say that because in the old days, we were taught like you want to get people back to their pre-morbid state. And then it's like, if it's a real trauma, not the way people use the word trauma today, but if it's a real trauma, it shatters you.
Yeah. Yep.
That person's gone in many
Yeah.
ways. So
Yeah.
you either get stronger and more resilient, more optimistic in some ways, or you become the opposite. You become more dysfunctional. So,
Yeah.
so our goal is to make people, more in the positive direction as much as possible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So I mean, I think that's such a good way to look at it, from the standpoint that the world and that person and that is no longer the same from that point forward. Um, and then there's other scenarios, right? Like complex PTSD, which is like a different sort of accumulation of events.
yeah,
Um,
well, I mean, that's, in many ways a different beast because that's happening when your brain is forming, when you're a child and your brain is still developing. So it has, a whole different constellation attached to it. The treatment's much different. In fact, if somebody has had early childhood trauma and then they have something like October 7th, it's much, much harder to treat the trauma.
yep. Yeah. So October 7th, where were you when you first heard the news, and like were you in Israel, or were you in the United States at the time? What was going on when you first heard about the events of October 7th?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm on Pacific time. So my daughter woke me up and told me. And it was a slow unraveling because we didn't realize how big it was except over time. But
Hmm.
she woke me up and told me the initial part of the attack. And,
Hmm.
um, my best friend's daughter was supposed to be at the Nova Festival.
Wow.
And so we were just worried, like who was there. The stories were coming out, about what was happening in the kibbutzim. Um, in the Negev there in the south of Israel, and it was unbelievable stories, beyond most people's imaginations, because we
Yeah.
usually project who we are and what we've experienced onto the world, and this is not who most people are or what
Right.
they've experienced. So it was just a constant shattering of the worldview and what humans are able to do. In that way, similar to the Holocaust, which was more than just killing. It was, torture and sadism and
Yeah.
mutilation and, all kinds of layers of trauma on top of trauma.
Hmm. And did you initially feel a call to action, like from this? You know, with your skills and your interests and your abilities, was that sort of your first reaction, or did it take a while to get there?
I mean, I think for the first week, I was just gathering information
Hmm.
and I was just, uh, not shocked exactly, but I was just kind of, in a state like gathering all the information and trying to process it. And I don't just mean
Hmm.
cognitive information. I mean, it was emotional, physical information. Again, with my gut. Um,
Hmm.
and I think, then when I saw these, protests internationally, which happened just a few days after,
Right.
and I saw the glee of some people that were relishing in it, and
Hmm.
in the, uh, torture and humiliation, which is part of what I think many of the people were relishing, um, and the celebration, and then the tapes started to come out. Also like of the Hamas had their go cams, and some of their phone calls were, hacked, and you could see how they were celebrating. That's what
Right.
really got me,
Yeah.
because that's a whole other level of, it's not like, um I mean, I think the word evil is sometimes overused, but I don't know any other word to describe that, even though I think that that may be in all of us humans. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
um Somehow to be part of a culture or a society that's not ashamed of that
Hmm.
really disturbed me. And I realized, and this is international, in London and New York and, all across, and in Paris. I
Hmm.
realized we're really in trouble. And if we don't do something to try to heal this in whatever way we can, the world's going to be in a very bad place. So that's
Yeah.
more that was the coup de grace for me.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. The That really took it to a different emotional level, um, and um, really sort of changed the intensity. I mean, of it was seeing that made it, so much more personal. I think for so many people, seeing those celebrations and the glee, and driving through the streets with, like they had just won the lottery. It was just horrific.
And when you talked
So
about social support, a few minutes ago, it's so important. It's a very important factor for being able to overcome trauma. I don't,
yep.
overcome is probably a bad word, but be able to glean as much positive stuff that you can so that you become better in certain ways. That social support is so important. And, to have the opposite of that. So it's like the people who went through this, horrific trauma. The Nova massacre was, to this day, is the biggest massacre in music history.
Hmm.
And for them to go through that and then to have, they pick up the paper, they go on the internet or they watch TV, and to see like all these people glad about it, that undermines all of the work that good people are trying to do in trying to help survivors.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different responses to trauma, and services that are sometimes provided in like an ideal scenario, like social workers being on site, and you know um, people coming to aid. And certainly we hear so many heroic stories of what happened on that day.
Hmm.
um, However, for certain people, the vulnerabilities of having this become a lasting trauma experience could have been there before, right? Um, their predisposition for having October 7th or the Nova Festival massacre be um, much more impactful can be on an individual basis, right?
Yes, yes, certainly there are certain factors that can make one more likely to get PTSD, for sure. Um, but October 7th was such a big trauma. Um, Almost everybody has in Israel has some sort of traumatic
Right.
response to it,
Yeah,
and the
makes sense.
country is overwhelmed because one of the factors, as you already mentioned, is if there was some early childhood trauma. That's a big factor to make one have a more intense and more protracted response to trauma. But there's also, the type of trauma that it is, and how big it is, and how close you were to being killed, and how much of your body was impacted. There's all these factors that make it more likely. Um,
Yeah.
so, to some extent, genetic factors, to some extent, how much previously you're able to regulate your emotions. Um, so there's many, many factors, but October 7th was so many traumas at once. And, the Jewish community is very small. And so everybody knows somebody that was impacted. And there is the ripple effect of that throughout the Jewish community. And my work is not just with the Jewish community. We are working with Palestinians as well as in Israel, also Bedouins and the Druze community. So the Druze is a different religion. For people that don't know, it
Mhm.
started off being a part of Islam, and then separated uh, just a little bit later.
Yeah.
And the Bedouins are Muslims, um, and those communities were very much impacted by October 7th and what has been happening since October 7th.
Right.
So
Yeah. So
thir-
taking
30,
from
31 Bedouins were murdered by
mm,
Hamas, and we listened to their stories, and we gave them some neurostimulation as well, and the stories are just unbelievable stories. I don't know if you want me to share one or
I do.
not. Okay.
I do want to. Yeah.
Okay. So there was one Bedouin man who's an MD, and on the morning of October 7th, because this happened at about 6:30 in the morning, Israel time, he was driving to his clinic, and he saw some injured people on the street. He didn't know at that time, of course, that the Nova massacre was occurring. And like a good Samaritan, he stopped to help them. And when he stopped, he was grabbed by Hamas, and they tied him to a post along the side of the street and used him as bait, so that when other Nova survivors who were escaping would see him, or other people would see him, they would stop their car to try to help him. And then Hamas would grab those people. And he witnessed them do such horrible things to the people, he
Mm.
can't even talk about it. He was tied to the post for about 6 hours until the Israeli army came and there was a shootout and finally was able to rescue him. But he's severely traumatized. Um, and, the Bedouins are very much a very tight, cohesive community according to their
Yeah.
tribe. And we met with the leaders of one of the tribes there whose grandfather was actually brought there, uh, sold in the Arab slave market. And
Mm.
after that was over, he resided in Israel and joined the IDF, actually, joined the army. And so when all of these Bedouins were murdered, they came to him to help them. And so he organized, he's an amazing man. He organized, the different tribes and the different people together. And they have a very different response to trauma than, the responses are shaped. And when I say response, I mean the action responses are shaped by the culture.
So let me ask you about that because I mean, I I heard many stories about Bedouin responses were more very like dive into the fire and pull people out and load load people in a truck and drive them away, like very action oriented. Is that what you're talking about?
Very action oriented. There were lots of people that did that. Bedouins, Druze, just everybody in the not every culture was represented. Who did that? The kind of bravery that came out is just phenomenal. Um, but the more cohesive cultures are able to also band together and the Bedouins did things that we don't normally see in our culture. Like uh, they got together $1 million and they wanted anybody who knew who kidnapped um, their brother, sister, friend. They were going to seek justice. They wanted the names of that person. They were going to seek
Hmm.
justice on their own. They weren't going to wait for the police or the IDF. I'll counter that with another story. So this is a Nova survivor that we treated. He's a 25-year-old man. Um, and he, most of the Nova survivors had taken some sort of drug because it was a music festival. And so most of them
Hmm.
were high during, whether it's a psychedelic or MDMA or ketamine. Most of them were high when Hamas invaded, which is a whole different population of what we're used to seeing. I mean, people, now there's more and more research coming out on using some of these psychedelics
Yeah.
on how to treat. But this is not how to treat. This is they were high when this trauma happened.
Right.
Um, and so this one young man, he was talking to a woman, a friend of his, and they were, just connecting when the missiles started to fly.
Mm-hmm.
And they're used to missiles flying in Israel, and they have the Iron Dome that shoots them down, but there's shrapnel when it shoots them down, and so you have to go into bomb shelters. And anyway, it doesn't get all the rockets, so you have to go into the bomb shelter.
Right.
So she didn't, and many of the Nova survivors didn't react very strongly because they're so used to seeing the missiles.
Hmm.
And but these were like hundreds. They didn't stop. And so finally they called off the festival and they're telling everybody to disperse. And he said, "Let's go." And she said to him, she didn't feel it was important to go because life is beautiful
Right.
and we're just going to listen to the music. And the last words that she said to him is, life is beautiful, basically.
Mm.
And he fled, and she didn't, and she was killed.
Mm.
And and he wrote a song about it. He wrote a song about
Wow.
life is beautiful.
Wow.
And he interspersed it with live footage because many of the, you know, that generation, they were filming even while they're running. They'd run and they'd hide, and they're filming. And so he
Mm.
interspersed it with some live footage, and then with this hope that life will be beautiful again. So that's a
Wow.
different reaction.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So on that note, just to kind of back up, when did you take action and start getting involved, and what were what was your kind of initial steps of wanting to help, and what did that look like?
So because I've been in the field for over 30 years, and I've treated all kinds of trauma, whether it's early childhood, sexual abuse. In Los Angeles, we have a lot of refugees from Iran. 9/11 also. We have New Yorkers that have moved here
Mm-hmm.
quite soon after 9/11. So, I mean, I've seen the whole continuum for many decades. And I had seen in my own experience that adding neurostimulation to help facilitate resetting the nervous system, basically, was essential. That it helped expedite trauma treatment, and it also helped deepen it too. And I knew that not that many people were using neurostimulation, so I
Mm-hmm.
got together a team of people. One is in Seattle, actually.
Mm.
His name is Dr. Rich Adler. He's a forensic psychiatrist. He's been excellent. He's
Yeah.
on our scientific advisory board. He's been excellent at
Okay.
advising us. And Texas, Florida, New York, and then we have specialists in Jerusalem and one Druze specialist who lives up in the north of Israel where the Druze live. And so we got together, a neurologist, actually army researchers, um, psychiatrists, neuropsychologists, just people who do neurostimulation, and said, we've got to come together as a team and figure this out and help. And so we did. And for 2 months, I flew out there to Israel, developed collaborative relationships with other organizations there, and treated Nova survivors and some people from the kibbutzim in the south, which was just horrific because that's where torture and mutilation and such was involved. Um, and and then we went to different hospitals and trained some of the medical providers there in just simple neurostimulation, and because we wanted to scale the effect, and our goal was to just reset them so that they could tolerate trauma treatment because they were so traumatized. When I first met them, they could not sit down long enough to fill out the intake.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, they didn't want to be in psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the ones that were in psychotherapy were not the ones that we met anyway. And we have a selected sample, of course. We're not finding it that helpful because how can they take in any of the therapy if they're like this?
Right.
So our goal was just to reset them and then refer them to trauma specialists in Israel, and just keep doing that. You
So it
know,
was like acute trauma care.
it was acute trauma care with most of them. With some of the really extreme ones, with severe PTSD, for them we did something more intensive. So we had professional neurostimulation devices that we brought in, not just the simple ones, like the one that I'm wearing right now is just a
Yeah.
simple one that you
Yeah.
can get online. Um, and we used our professional equipment, and then simultaneously we would do trauma treatment with them, which is one of the reasons. Another reason I love neurostimulation is you can layer the treatments,
Right.
and so that's what we did with them.
Okay.
And
And
now we're flying out some of the most severe PTSD people in Israel and flying them out and taking care of them here, and then sending them
this is
back.
all done through charitable support, or are they having to fund their own trips, or what?
No, no. I started a nonprofit called Israel Healing Initiative. It's israelhealinginitiative.org. You can see photos of some of our survivors. We're also on Instagram, and
Yeah.
you can see videos of before and after with some of the survivors that we've done. So through this nonprofit, we're looking to gather more funds actually to scale it even bigger. But those are the things we do. We fly out, we see them, we fly them back here. Some of the severe ones, and we do here. We're able to do some treatments that are not yet approved in Israel, but that are approved in the States and in Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So we have more freedom here to treat them.
Mm-hmm.
But the next thing we want to do, one of the Palestinians that we've begun treating right now, he's a peace activist, and he wants to help us buy some of the simple VNS units, the vagus nerve stimulator units. We want to give 3,000 to Israel and 3,000 to Gaza, just to help people be able to sleep better, to help them calm down through the day, to help them retrain their nervous system to come down. He's
Mm-hmm.
rightfully concerned more about what happens after the war when you've got all these brains that are malfunctioning. Because, keep in mind, trauma is a neurological event, it's not
Mm-hmm.
just
Right.
thoughts, it impacts the way the brain is functioning in measurable ways.
Right.
And to have brains that are malfunctioning like that, to have tens of thousands, millions of brains malfunctioning like that,
Yeah.
um, anything that we can do that we can scale and sending them VNS units is one of the simplest things to do. It's only
Yeah.
$350 a unit, even sometimes
Yeah.
less. Sometimes we can get them for
Yeah.
300. Um, and to these people are going to be making decisions on both sides of the divide,
Yeah.
and they're going to be reacting to things, and anything we can do to kind of help cool down that region is, I think, vital, and I think it can make a
Mm-hmm.
dent. So that's
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the things that we're working on to try to raise funds
Yeah.
for.
That's a very practical solution. I mean, as someone who I personally use vagal nerve stimulator, much like the one that you're using, and with my patients as well. And it's just so simple and so effective.
Yeah,
And some of my patients with trauma say it's their favorite part of the day.
yeah. Oh yeah, we are working with one of the Army researchers told us that this is U.S. Army. He told us that when he was giving it to the U.S. vets, he was giving it, for them to take home and use, right, so that they can also use it somewhat before they go to sleep to help them sleep. And he said that he had to take the units away from them because they were using it too much. They didn't
Right.
want to.
They didn't want to come out of that
They didn't
state.
want to
Yeah.
come out of that state. So, by the way, and I want you to know that we are responsible. We're not just going to hand out. Our goal is not just to hand
Sure.
this out. We're going to have videos in Arabic and in Hebrew on how to
Nice.
use it, and what the risk fact, all this kind of stuff is going to be
Amazing.
with it.
That's
So,
so great.
yeah,
Wow. Yeah. So with the people that you interacted with, what what were some of the surprises of the some surprises that you didn't expect that came out of that early experience? Like, you kind of had your your clinical mind on, and you're a human, you're obviously impacted with what's taken place, and you kind of go into the situation, almost like you know you're in ground zero. I mean, you're there.
Yeah.
And that's what were some of the surprises that you had that you were just not expecting?
So I was humbled. I was humbled, actually. I didn't expect that. Um, when I remember, it was within a month after October 7th, I met with a survivor who was another hero. He saved 30 people, and severely traumatized. And he's, sat on the edge of the couch and he said, I have 600, I don't want to speak, but I have 600 souls inside of me who are
Hmm.
forcing me to speak, and I have to
Wow.
speak. And I would hear things like that, similar to that.
Hmm.
I still hear it today, you know. Um, just last week, I was treating a survivor here in Los Angeles. And when I went to do his QEEG, and when it was, the condition of eyes closed, I'm looking, at his brain on the screen. And I see after about 2 minutes, there's some disturbance that happened. But and after we're done, I said to him, by the way, what happened about 2 minutes in? And what he said was he saw the women that he couldn't save.
Hmm.
So this is the man that saved dozens of people, does not see himself as a hero, but all he can see when he closes his eyes is a repeat of the several women he could not save.
Hmm.
I mean, how I'm just blown away by the level of humanity. And these kinds of things, by the way, these kinds of responses are more common in people who have high empathy and who also have rumination. This particular man, by the way, he didn't check off on his intake rumination, but we saw it in the QEEG, and
Hmm.
I asked him about it, and he said yes. And sure enough, those two factors, when they go together, it does lead to more of this. Um, of course, rumination and empathy, when those are joined together, you can imagine, of course, it's going to lead to, oh my gosh, I couldn't save this. I feel the pain of this woman, and I couldn't save her. And
Hmm.
so last week is we're almost, we're 10 months out now, and he still is sleeping poorly. I mean, we're just beginning treatment with him, but he tells me he sleeps between 2 to 4 hours a night. And what is waking him up is, the women that he couldn't save.
Yeah. You know, it's there's there's so much that I've seen when talking about the humanity and the humbleness is to see and hear how much people care about, and what they're discussing and talking about are things bigger than themselves. And it's not only about their own experience, it's about people around them, other people. It's very um it's 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 an interesting, not it's not self-centered, it's
The
the
boundary
impact.
between self and other just dissolves. That's what I've seen over and over again. If you saw the speech at the DNC yesterday
Yeah.
by the parents, Goldberg
Yeah, I
Poland
did.
of Hirsch, who is a hostage.
Right.
If you listen to her speech, her speech is mainly, all of the other hostages that are there. There's
Yeah.
whatever it was, 23 nationalities and all these different religions, and it's just a union with everybody else who's suffering. And
Yeah.
she was the only person who mentioned Palestinian suffering. I think before, Kamala mentioned it, but this was before Kamala's speech, right? She was the only person that mentioned it. Not surprising, because this
Yeah.
is one of the things that I'm seeing with this population of people who were harmed on October 7th. The boundaries between self and others very extremely permeable.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, and there is, I think, ingrained in Jewish culture, this sense, or Jewish religion, even, when you sit shiva, and when a mourner is sitting there, there's a blessing that you give to the mourner, of like comfort amongst the other mourners
Mhm,
of Yerushalayim. This sense of that we're all in this together,
mhm,
and it's not just about my own suffering. It's about the person I couldn't save, or the person, my friend, or the person I couldn't get to. Or it's just so unbelievably, like you said, humbling and inspiring, to sit in that space and to really see the pure humanness within that.
mhm.
um, Thanks for sharing that, because it's something I've witnessed, but hearing someone else say it and express it, um, really brings that home.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, when you're talking to uh, Nova survivors, how much of their experience of is somatic now? Like, how much of the trauma is affecting physical symptoms, like new physical symptoms?
I think it would be like 100%. I mean, I
Yeah.
have to go through each one in my mind, but how could it not be?
Yeah. I mean, can you talk about that a little bit? Because I don't, I think people who haven't had, aren't trauma aware, might not understand that.
Well, first of um, all of them are having sleep difficulties. So that's number one.
Hmm.
Someone who I saw a couple of months ago, he, um, had an onset of tics. Never had them for,
Yeah.
I think he had it when he was a little kid, but it resolved and he hasn't had it for 20 years because
Hmm.
he's about 25 now. And, all of a sudden it reoccurs and it's reoccurring, it's debilitating.
Mm.
Um, Almost all of them have gut issues.
Hmm.
Um, Many of them, for them to even sit long enough to look at their brain to do a QEEG, they were sweating. They couldn't handle sitting that long.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think, there's these experiences, like, um, with some trauma sufferers, or PTSD sufferers, is like, like having like a hole in your, feeling like you have a hole in your body, or like a profound sense of emptiness. And, you know, this is a real experience that's very embodied, and
Yes.
it's part of the healing path.
But that's
Um,
one of the nice things about the vagus nerve stimulator. It's so
yeah.
simple, but the vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve, right? It goes through all the major organs, including the gut, including the
Yeah.
stomach. So it's helpful in so many ways. It's so simple and
Yeah.
so helpful.
Yeah. And so, um, before we get into vagal stim, I'd love to just kind of hear how you're seeing your work with neurostim help and connect people, and use a really interesting term called post traumatic growth. Sort
Mhm.
of came across some you saying that in other interviews or what have you, and I love to kind of hear how the neurostim leads to this post traumatic growth, because you're saying like the ultimate goal of treatment is to emerge stronger.
Mhm.
Um, so can you talk about that?
Yeah. Um, so when someone's nervous system is so hyper aroused, or when, we look at three major networks in the brain when we do the Q, you know, um, and of course there's you know, the hallmark is just the limbic, the amygdala, and especially the functional connection between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal. I don't know how technical you want to get, but
Whatever you feel like.
so we look at those connections, and trauma can derail someone's attention system, so they can't focus, they can't work that well because well, for various obvious reasons. Of course their memory is impacted. um, it either intrudes, so they're trying to focus on something, and it'll, something in the past will intrude, and that's because the default mode network is not functioning properly anymore. Or, we see people who are dissociated. So, in the anterior regions of their brain, it's just disengaged. It's just going so slow. It's just not doing its job of either inhibiting amygdala activity, or in being able to sustain a focus, or in being able to regulate emotions, negative emotions that come up. And so for that, we need obviously more than a vagus nerve stimulator. We need to, uh, I was going to use the word attack, but that's probably
Yeah,
not the right word to use right now.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but we want to target our treatment to those areas that need more help in being able to function appropriately.
Hmm. Wow, that was so great. It would take reading through 10 research papers to understand it in that succinct way. So thanks for explaining that. I mean, even things like knowing that when the default mode network is not functioning well, you get intrusive thoughts. It makes sense because that's like the part of your brain where it allows you to kind of daydream, right? And
Hmm.
sort of just float a little bit. And if people don't understand that, people with PTSD, they can lose that ability.
Yeah. I mean, a large part of it comes because the salience network is misfunctioning, right? And
Hmm.
so it's not able to switch the gears from default mode to executive functioning as it should, depending upon what's happening, in the external world. And
Hmm.
so when that's not functioning well, you're going to get either intrusion or just the opposite.
Hmm. Okay. And so between neurostim sessions, it sounds like you like to help people understand the benefits of vagal nerve stimulation. So how does that fit in from like this this kind of strategy and healing response?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, all of the survivors, through our donations, we gave them a vagus nerve stimulator so they could use for themselves and also for their family, because the
Yeah.
mothers and their siblings and everybody are quite distressed, as you can imagine, too. And so they
Yeah.
would do that, and we would, tell them how much to use it and when to use it, depending upon what we saw in their cue, and also what we hear about how they're functioning, um, and depending upon what stage of trauma treatment they're in, because in the beginning we just want to settle them. That's just the beginning.
Yeah.
But then, eventually, for post-traumatic growth, we want to help them form a solid world view. People who had a world view that didn't include that bad things can happen, um,
Right.
they're more shattered. And so they have a lot more work to do. They're more in shock, they're more shattered, and they have to rebuild a whole new model of what the world is. And
Hmm.
we want them to build a model that, of course, the better representation of the world you have, the more accurate it is. Not one that makes you feel better, but the more
Hmm.
accurate it is, the better you're going to be able to function and traverse through all difficulties, to be able to predict properly, to be able to empower yourself when need be, to let yourself relax when need be, because you have an accurate model of the external world. But
Like a
also,
construct of reality.
yes, yeah, but also the way you represent your internal world, meaning who you are, your sense of self, that can be shattered, after that will be shattered more than likely after a trauma. And as you can see, many of the heroes, like just the 2 or 3 heroes that I already shared with you, they don't see themselves as heroes. So their
Hmm.
sense of self has not really yet incorporated the trauma. They're still stuck
Right.
on, my God, what happened to me? I didn't save enough people. I'm a failure.
Wow.
The world is such a horrible place, and look at how everybody hates us, as well. But by the way, which is another factor that we're seeing in October 7th that we didn't have to deal with 9/11, or um, many of the refugees that fled, or even with school shootings. We didn't have to deal with this factor that the world doesn't believe us or hates us.
Right.
And we're having to deal with that a lot with the October 7th survivors. So it actually
Right.
makes the world worse for all of your listeners. It makes the world worse. We don't want poorly functioning brains on this planet. Even if you have no empathy, it's not to your utilitarian advantage. Um, I really want to emphasize that, because people can do so much just by recognizing what's real. Not by recognizing what's not real, but by recognizing what's real.
Mm-hmm. I love that you say that, and just you know seeing the magnitude of the impact. There was the war. There's the war. There's what happened on October 7th, and then there's the war that's happening. On social media. There's the war that's happening in the various hate demonstrations, and all of this is taking is part of the toll, part of the trauma. Um,
Yeah, I
so.
just want to add an addendum to that. Um, because I can understand, like, the word trauma has been so diluted, not by real psychologists,
Hmm.
but by the public and other people who may come in, wanting to help, but they don't really understand trauma. It's been so diluted that people, and also now there's a social currency where you get more status if you've been traumatized. That's a new
Hmm.
thing. So a lot of times people will use that word just trying to, they'll exaggerate, or um, you know they'll exaggerate the impact of an event to because they get more social currency that way. If you provide an abundance of empathy for something that's not that real, I'm not saying not to be empathic, but because I'm just saying there's different levels of suffering and different levels of injury. And if you provide a whole lot of empathy for something that is just minimal, you can actually weaken the person.
Mm.
You're not helping, you're actually hurting.
Mm.
So I just wanted to add that addendum.
I get that. Well said. I mean, there's all kinds of resources people have, right, to overcome. And, you know, if we're not giving people the empowerment of strength of resources they actually have to rise out of something that might have been less fortunate or um, a painful time, then yeah, we're holding them back from their growth.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that, and I do, I think really resonate with how this word has been changed and conformed and um, in a way to really take away from people who actually the term really applies to. Um, so thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, I know you've been with me a long time here, and one of the main reasons I reached out to you is I really want to help your cause, and I'm interested in you know, helping get the word out. You talked a little bit about what you're needing for, what you're doing for support with the Israel Healing Initiative. Can you talk about what we can do to help you and your efforts and what you're needing now and kind of what the next several months look like for the organization?
Yeah. So we have enough volunteers right now. We have enough therapists who have volunteered to help. Um, we could probably use a couple of more in Israel. Um, but mostly what we need is we want to raise enough money to be able to, you know, give these devices to the families that need it. I want to emphasize this is a continuous trauma right now. It's not yet a post trauma. The missiles are still flying in Israel, the bombs are still dropping in Gaza. People are still on hyper alert. We're expecting that when the war is over, that there's going to be even more. The system is already overwhelmed. That there's going to be even more need at that point because then people can, um, you know, then it moves from continuous trauma to post trauma at that point. So we're going to need more manpower, and our volunteers are burnt out. Um, and we're going to need to start paying people.
Yeah.
So basically, what we need is more funds. We need more funds to pay people. We need more funds to um, pay for more devices that we can distribute en masse to people,
Yeah.
and um, funds to help train more people in Israel on how to use these devices.
Right.
And we have, as I mentioned before, we have a website you can donate at www.israelhealinginitiative.org, not .com, .org. You can also donate on our Instagram account for those that prefer to do it that way. We have
Yeah.
Facebook as well.
Okay. Great. Well, we'll definitely be getting the word out with this recording this episode, and I think it's there's a lot of different ways for people to show up. Some people um, show up with like call to action, uh, getting out there, getting flying over to Israel, getting getting right into the mix of things on helping, and other people it's through like prayer or spiritual means, and for other people it may be by financial support. All of it comes together and um, you know makes impact. It's all connected, all the different kinds of giving and all the kinds of different action. So I first want to just say that, like, when I first got introduced to you, the person who you introduced me to is Lori, and she said that you were her hero, and I can really see why. I mean, it's it takes a special person to just go and figure it out and just show up and say that we're going to help and we're here for you. And, who knows how many future generations you saved by that. Very impactful.
I mean, this was a gift from my Holocaust surviving father. I'm just passing it
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. Well, and everybody you inspire is a gift from your
That's
father
right.
as well.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
how we
Thank
that's
you.
how we do it.
I'll let him know.
So thank you so much for being here. And I
Mhm.
will say that, I think we'll, nobody really knows the true answers of why this is all happening. And we may never get closure in our lifetime from this, but it's great to know there's people out there helping, people try to make some semblance of moving forward. And so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and for, I mean, I can feel you being a part of this with us,
Uh,
and,
Thanks.
just thank you for spreading the word because there are other souls like you and us out there. I know there, I think there's many of them, and just contact me.
We'll get this all out to as many people as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the One Thing Podcast. Please share these episodes with your friends, loved ones, colleagues, patients, healthcare providers, anyone who you feel might benefit from hearing these informative interviews. We tend to learn best from people sharing things with us. That's often the first time it's introduced. So don't hesitate if the content of these episodes reminded you of someone that might benefit from it. Forward the episode to them, and I'm sure they'll either appreciate it or be appreciative that you've thought of them. So once again, we'll look forward to seeing you next episode on the One Thing Podcast. And again, much appreciation for you being here with me.